The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song overhead as Katie Morrison pulled into the parking lot at Oak Creek Memorial, the November cold already working its way through her jacket. She sat in her car for exactly 13 seconds, a habit from a lifetime ago, before grabbing her badge and heading through the employee entrance. The smell hit her first. Antiseptic. Stale coffee. That particular blend of industrial cleaner and human suffering that never quite washed out of the walls. The locker room was empty at 6:56 a.m., which was how Katie preferred it. She opened her assigned locker, third row, far left, and pulled off her street clothes with the efficiency of someone who had learned to move through the world without drawing attention. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation, forgettable. She tied them carefully, tucked her badge into the left pocket where it wouldn't catch or swing. Her hands, when she looked at them, showed the faint white lines of old scars across the knuckles. Surgical scars. Or so the surface story went. She wrapped them with practiced indifference and turned to leave. At the very back of her locker, hidden behind the stack of clean scrubs she laundered at home each week, sat the pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan leather, scuffed and creased from thousands of miles of wear. The soles were nearly flat from patrol routes through Helmand Province. The right boot had a small hole in the toe where shrapnel had come a little too close. She hadn't worn them in 20 years. Hadn't touched them in 3 months. But she kept them there, the way other people kept photographs or wedding rings. A relic of someone else's life. A person no one at Oak Creek Memorial knew existed. She pushed them deeper into the locker and closed the door. The ICU came alive as the day shift filtered in. Nurses moving with the careful precision of chess players, each knowing their territory, their patients, their place in the hierarchy that had nothing to do with official titles. Katie moved through them like water finding its level. She didn't make eye contact. Didn't join the conversation cluster near the coffee station where 3 nurses were laughing about someone's terrible dating app match. Just collected her assignment sheet from the charge nurse, 4 patients, 3 of them stable, and began her rounds. Room for 07 held an elderly man named Chen, 73 years old, post-op from abdominal surgery 5 days prior. His surgical site looked clean. The drainage tube was running clear. His vitals were steady, unremarkable, the kind of patient who would be discharged in 2 more days and never think about nurses again. Katie checked his chart methodically. 8 pages of notes, each one in her own handwriting. Each one precise. Each one noting things that most nurses wouldn't bother documenting, slight discoloration around the incision site on post-op day 3 that resolved by day 4, a temperature spiked to 100.6 that the attending had dismissed as normal surgical response but that Katie had flagged anyway. "How are you feeling this morning, Mr. Chen?" Her voice was soft, unremarkable as her presence. The kind of voice that didn't demand anything from anyone. "Good, good. Ready to go home?" He smiled. Didn't ask her name. Never did. She spent 43 minutes in that room, checking every line, every drain, every dressing. She could have done it in 15. But Katie Morrison had learned long ago that thoroughness was a kind of invisibility. The more meticulously she worked, the less anyone questioned why she did it. The less anyone suspected that she knew when something was wrong before the machine started screaming about it. It was 7:22 a.m. when she finished room for 07 and moved to room for 10, where a woman named Patricia Jacobson lay recovering from her son's spinal fusion surgery. The boy, Daniel, 26, construction worker, was stable, healing well. Katie pulled up the chart and began reading through the operative notes. The surgeon had been Dr. Hargrove, chief of surgery at Oak Creek Memorial for the past 14 years. High-volume provider. Excellent surgical outcomes on paper. The kind of doctor who made the hospital money. The kind of doctor whose billing patterns, when you looked at them carefully, didn't quite match what his hands had actually done in the operating room. Katie had noticed it 3 weeks ago while reviewing charts. Procedures billed for on patients who never made it to the OR. Phantom surgeries. Each one worth between $8,000 and $47,000, depending on the complexity claimed. She had started keeping a separate notebook, not in the hospital system, never in the hospital system, documenting the discrepancies. Small enough that no individual case would trip any alarms. Significant enough that if she ever connected them into a pattern, the whole structure would collapse. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. That was the careful part. That was the part that required patience. Katie had learned patience in Sangin, where a single careless word could unravel a surveillance operation and get Marines killed. The hospital was warming up now. More staff moving through the corridors. The sound of beds being adjusted, monitors beeping their steady reassurance, the distant page overhead calling for a housekeeping supervisor. Katie finished reviewing Daniel Jacobson's charts and noted that his post-operative fever from the previous day, 101.2, persistent despite acetaminophen, seemed to have resolved. But she made a note anyway. Flags for possible infection if the temperature returned. Documentation. Always documentation. The careful accumulation of evidence that nobody would look at until something went catastrophically wrong. She was updating his fluid intake output record when she heard footsteps approaching with a different rhythm than the normal hospital pace. Heavier. Deliberately audible. The kind of footsteps that announce their own authority. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway at 7:51 a.m., already in his surgical scrubs, already radiating the particular magnetism of someone who had never been told no. He was 56 years old, carried himself like a man 10 years younger, had the kind of tan that came from either a winter vacation or a solarium that probably violated hospital policy. Behind him trailed the Jacobsons, Daniel's parents, visiting early, nervous in the way that family members always were in hospitals. "Ah, Katie," he said. Not her first name. Just Katie. The way someone might say the name of a tool. "I'm just going to check on Daniel here." She stepped back without being asked. Of course she did. That was the pattern. That was how these things worked. What happened next would be the first real test of her composure in a long time. But for now, as Katie stood in the corner of the room with her hands folded, her face perfectly blank, her breathing steady, she was simply a nurse. Just a nurse. Invisible. Unremarkable. The kind of person people forgot about before they even left the room. Except for the scars on her knuckles. Except for the pair of combat boots hidden in the back of her locker. Except for the 20-year-old muscle memory in her hands that made them steady as surgical steel even when everything inside her was tracking exits, reading distances, assessing threat levels with the precision of someone who had learned to survive by assuming the worst. Except for the man she had saved in Sangin, who was somewhere in the world still alive because of decisions she had made in the dark, and who had no idea she was in this hospital at all. The question wasn't whether her carefully constructed anonymity would hold. The question was what would happen when someone walked through a door and recognized exactly who she was. Dr. Hargrove swept into the Jacobson family room with a kind of confidence that filled hallways like cologne. Katie was checking the post-op fever chart when she felt the shift in air pressure that meant he'd arrived. The family huddled around their son's bed, anxious. Their boy was 4 hours out of appendectomy. Fever of 101.2. Nothing unusual, but Katie had suggested cultures anyway. "I see we're concerned about a little temperature," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the particular condescension reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. He didn't look at Katie. He addressed the parents as if she were furniture. Post-op fevers are completely normal. The body's inflammatory response. Stress fever. It happens in probably 90% of uncomplicated cases. Katie stood at the bedside, her hand steady as she documented vitals. She'd seen this infection pattern before. 12 years of battlefield triage taught her to recognize early sepsis the way most people recognized their own heartbeat. The mother looked at her son's flushed face, then back at Katie. But the nurse mentioned, the mother started. The nurse. Hargrove finally turned toward Katie, and his smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, how many post-op complications have you managed? 10 years? 15? Or are we being generous with your basic competence here?" He didn't wait for an answer. Fever workup isn't indicated until 72 hours. That's standard protocol. Everyone knows that. Katie turned slightly. Made eye contact. Breathed once, measured and slow. The corner of her mouth didn't twitch. She simply resumed writing on the chart. We'll monitor closely, she said to the mother. Temperature every 2 hours. I'll watch for any changes. Hargrove laughed. Actually laughed. By all means, nurse. Document away. Just try not to create unnecessary panic while you're at it. He walked out, his shoes clicking against the tile floor like punctuation. The mother looked embarrassed. The father looked confused. Their son looked away. Katie finished her note and said, I'll be back in 30 minutes to recheck him, as if nothing had happened. Her voice was perfectly level. Her hands didn't shake. But the calculation was happening behind her eyes. Post-op day 1. Fever pattern. Slight tachycardia at 102. The boy's name was Marcus. He was 17. He had a girlfriend in the photo on his nightstand. 2 hours later, a write-up appeared on the break room bulletin board. Official letterhead. Hargrove's signature in that aggressive fountain pen scrawl. Katie read it once while the coffee machine hissed behind her. Insubordination and poor clinical judgment, it stated. Staff member overstepped scope of practice by recommending diagnostic workup contrary to physician direction. Creates liability and undermines department protocol. Nobody had signed off on it. Nobody had asked her side. It was just there, posted like a notice of eviction. She folded it once and put it in her pocket. Lunch was at 12:38 p.m. Katie carried her container to the break room, turkey sandwich, carrots, and apple she'd bought from the hospital cafe. The room was full. 12 nurses, 2 respiratory therapists, 1 social worker. She'd eaten lunch here for 3 years without incident. The table nearest the window had an open seat. She sat down. Opened her container. Started eating. One by one, the room changed temperature. A nurse 2 seats down, Sarah, who'd borrowed Katie's stethoscope a week ago, grabbed her tray. Walked to the corner. 2 others followed. Then the respiratory therapist stood up simultaneously, like they'd rehearsed it. The social worker looked uncomfortable but stayed. Katie cut another piece of carrot. Chewed it. The room filled with the sounds of other people's conversations, purposefully loud. Laughter that seemed directed at nothing and everything. The fluorescent panels above buzzed their mechanical hum. She could feel Hargrove across the room at the senior staff table. He was watching. Waiting for her to crack. To rush out. To cry in the bathroom or call her union rep or show any sign that the weight of social erasure was breaking her down. She'd seen him do this before to residents who questioned him. Interns who gave him pushback. His power wasn't just institutional, it was social. He could make a room decide you didn't exist. Katie set down her fork. Maintained eye contact with him across that distance. It lasted 3 seconds. 4. 5. The silence was the kind you could operate in. I've seen worse men than you fall harder, she said quietly. Not angry. Not bitter. Just a statement of fact, delivered to the room but meant for him. Her voice was low enough that only those within 8 feet heard it, which was precisely 8 feet of people. She wiped away the single tear that had escaped without ever looking away from his face. Then she stood, closed her container, and walked back to her patients. The afternoon stretched. Katie moved through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors with a kind of calculated efficiency. Room for 12, Mr. Chen, post-CABG surgery, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation 96%. Room for 15, Mrs. Reeves, acute appendicitis admit, labs pending. Room for 18, Marcus Jacobson, still febrile at 101.8, heart rate elevated. She took his blood cultures herself, using a 20-gauge needle, drawing from his peripheral line. The samples went to the lab with a note requesting priority processing. Standard procedure. She documented everything with precision. Hargrove passed her in the hallway at 3:22 p.m. He had a resident trailing him like a satellite. He didn't acknowledge her. She didn't acknowledge him. But she felt the weight of knowing exactly what he'd done and exactly why. His fraud wasn't random. It was systematic. Phantom surgeries on uninsured patients who wouldn't follow up. Billing inflations on cardiac cases where families were too overwhelmed to review itemized statements. And the kickbacks flowing to administrators who kept their eyes carefully closed. Katie's meticulous charting was a problem because charting created a paper trail. Questions about billing created audits. Competence in documentation created liability for people like Hargrove. She'd never said a word to him about it. She'd just been doing her job properly. And proper work, in a corrupt system, is the same as rebellion. She stayed until 7:14 p.m., well past shift change, because Marcus's cultures had been flagged urgent at 6:51 p.m. Blood cultures positive. She called the resident on service, who panicked. She called Hargrove, who didn't answer his personal phone until the third attempt. His cultures are positive, Katie said. 2 out of 2 bottles growing gram-negative cocci. Likely E. coli or Klebsiella. He needs broad-spectrum coverage now. The resident isn't sure which antibiotics to order. Hargrove's voice came back tight and fast. Why didn't you wait for me to review? Because it's 6:51 p.m. and he's septic, Katie said. I can transfer him to ICU if you want me to. A pause. The sound of him understanding that a delay could kill the kid. Start ceftriaxone, 1 gram for Q12H. And vancomycin, 15 to 20 milligrams per kilogram. Get an ECG. I'm coming in. Katie ordered the antibiotics herself, watching the resident's hands shake as he tried to calculate dosages. She showed him the math. Showed him how to set the 4 pump. Showed him that competence was just the willingness to look when everyone else was looking away. By the time Hargrove arrived at 7:06 p.m., the antibiotics were running, Marcus was on continuous cardiac monitoring, and his temperature had already started to stabilize. Katie clocked out at 8:19 p.m. She sat in her car in the parking lot for exactly 6 minutes, her hands resting on the steering wheel, rain starting to tap against the windshield. She thought about the combat boots still hidden in her closet at home. The pair she'd worn in Sangin 14 years ago when she was someone else entirely, someone people saluted and listened to without question. She thought about her daughter asking why Mommy was home early. She thought about Hargrove's smile. She thought about Marcus Jacobson's blood cultures turning positive right on schedule because that's what happened when infection found weakness. She drove home through the rain with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained all day. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Some sit alone in break rooms while the world decides they don't matter. Some carry secrets so heavy they reshape the way you stand. Katie Morrison drove through Raleigh knowing exactly what she was about to lose and precisely why she'd lose it. Tuesday morning started like any other shift at Oak Creek Memorial. Katie arrived at 6:52, 15 minutes before the 7 o'clock briefing, and pushed through the employee entrance like she always did, head down, badge clipped to scrubs, the worn leather of her combat boots hidden beneath regulation white clogs in her locker. Nobody at this hospital knew those boots existed. Nobody knew anything about Sangin or the 12 years before she became just another floor nurse in Raleigh. The waiting room filled by mid-morning with the usual rotation of family members, patients checking vitals, an old man in a baseball cap reading a newspaper nobody used anymore. Katie was charting post-operative vitals on the 3rd floor when the first scream cut through the floor like a siren. Not a medical emergency scream. Different. Raw animal panic. She heard the crash before anything else, something heavy hitting the ground floor security desk, then voices erupting. Boots on tile. Running. A man's voice, deep and jagged, screaming something about a mother, about doctors, about lies and murder. Katie's hands paused over the keyboard. Around her, Other nurses exchanged glances. The kind of glances that said run. An overhead code came through the intercom, but the voice was fractured, panicked, security to waiting room. Code Grey. Waiting room now. Code Grey. Active threat. Katie moved to the hallway. From 3 floors up, she could hear the chaos spilling upward through the stairwell, footsteps thundering, a woman's voice shouting, get down, somebody call 911, the sound of chairs overturning like dominoes. Her colleagues were already moving in the opposite direction, pushing toward the stairwells on the east wing, hands gripping charts and phones. The protocol was automatic. Everyone knew it. Threat appears, you go the other way. You seal doors. You wait. Katie was already moving down. The stairwell echoed with the sound of bodies descending, people pushing past each other, a nurse in surgical scrubs nearly dropping her laptop as she fled. Katie went against the current like a salmon swimming upstream, her hand steady on the rail, her breathing controlled, 5 in through the nose, 5 out through the mouth, a rhythm she hadn't needed in 6 years but her body remembered anyway. The muscle memory of calm when the world was falling apart. The second floor door swung open and Katie was in the upper corridor of the waiting room. She could see him from 20 feet away. 6'5", maybe 6'6", wearing a grey hoodie stained with something that might have been coffee or might have been blood from his own hands. His knuckles were split and raw, fists clenched so hard the tendons stood out like cables beneath the skin. He had a pistol. Not pointed at anyone in particular, just held at waist level, his arm shaking the way an engine shakes when it's going to explode. The other staff members were gone. 2 orderlies had already cleared toward the administrative wing. The front desk was empty, abandoned, papers scattered across the surface like they'd been dropped mid-thought. The waiting room itself was a study in evacuation, overturned chairs, a child's shoe left behind, a purse spilled open with its contents bleeding across the linoleum. 43 seconds. That was how long it had taken for everyone to decide this wasn't their fight. The man's breathing was wrong. She could hear it from across the room, not panicked hyperventilation exactly, but close. Short gasps through his teeth, his shoulders rising and falling in irregular spikes. His eyes were fixed on nothing, pupils dilated so wide the blue was almost gone. His lips were moving but no words were coming out, just sounds, repetitive animal noises, the kind of sounds people make when their nervous system has overridden their brain completely. Katie Morrison had talked down a Taliban compound full of 47 fighters outside Sangin in 2000 for using nothing but her voice and her knowledge of how human nervous systems break. She'd spent 6 hours convincing a man with an AK-47 and 3 grenades not to kill himself in front of 30 American soldiers. She knew what this looked like. She knew what this was. She walked toward him. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just movement. Her hands visible, palms open, her arms angled away from her body in the universal gesture of non-threat. Her breathing was still controlled. The other nurses would have said later, if they'd stayed to see it, that she walked like someone crossing her own living room on a quiet Sunday morning, nothing urgent, nothing forced. Just a person moving through space. "Hey," Katie said. Her voice was low, measured, the tone of someone speaking to a spooked horse. "Hey. I'm Katie. I'm a nurse here." The man's head jerked toward the sound. The pistol rose slightly, his arm uncurling from his waist. His breathing got worse. Faster. The kind of spiral that precedes a complete nervous system shutdown. Katie kept walking. Slowly. 3 more steps. She could see his pupils now, blown completely wide, dilated so far there was almost no iris visible. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had already decided the world was over and was just waiting for his body to catch up. "My mother," he said. Just those 2 words. His voice cracked at the edges like old paint. "My mother died. They killed her. They said she was in recovery. She was never in recovery. She was in a grave the whole time they billed insurance for surgery on a dead woman." Katie understood. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. She'd seen families shatter like this in Kandahar when they found out their son wasn't coming home. Grief that had nowhere to go except into violence, into the question that screamed through every cell, why is she dead and the men who did it still breathing? "I believe you," Katie said. She was 8 feet away now. Close enough to see the sweat running down his temples, close enough to count the times his chest rose and fell in 1 minute. 93 breaths. His body was heading toward a full autonomic cascade. "I believe you. What's your name?" They lied. "What's your name?" She asked it again, same tone, same patience. The voice of someone who had learned that repetition was sometimes the only way to anchor a person to the moment. "Marcus." His voice was smaller this time. The pistol wavered, his arm getting tired, the tremor in his hand becoming more pronounced. "Marcus Tyson. My mother was Margaret Tyson. She came here for gallbladder surgery. Routine. 30-minute procedure. She was 74 and she was routine." Katie was 5 feet away now. She could smell him, sweat and something acrid underneath, probably adrenaline converting to something toxic in his bloodstream. Her own heart rate was steady. 102 beats per minute. Controlled. Professional. She'd been here before, just in different climates, with different weapons, under moonlight instead of fluorescent lights that buzzed their mechanical song overhead. "I'm going to keep talking," Katie said. "And you're going to listen. Not because I'm telling you to. Because you need someone to see your mother with you right now. And I see her. Okay? I see Margaret. I see someone you loved. I'm seeing her." Marcus's breathing was still wrong, but something shifted in his face. A microscopic loosening around the eyes. The jaw unclenched for a fraction of a second. Katie took one more step. She was 3 feet away now, close enough that she could take the pistol if she needed to, close enough that she could see the individual beads of sweat on his forehead. But she didn't reach for it. Instead, she let her own hands hang open at her sides. "You're hyperventilating," she said. Not in the tone of instruction. Just matter of fact, like she was commenting on the weather. "Your body is dumping too much carbon dioxide. Your hands are probably numb right now. Maybe your lips. That's your nervous system. Not your mind. Your mind is fine. Your mind is justified. But your body is in crisis. We need to bring your body back. Can you do something for me? I'm going to kill him." "Not while you're hyperventilating," Katie said. "You can't even hold the pistol steady. You can barely stand. You're about to have a full collapse. And when you do, you'll lose consciousness and the pistol will hit the floor and hospital security will take it and you'll wake up in a medical unit." Is that what Margaret would want? Something in her voice, the absolute absence of judgment, the lack of fear underneath every word, made Marcus look at her directly. Really look at her. Not through her, not at the idea of her, but at the actual woman standing 3 feet away with her hands open and her breathing controlled and her eyes that had seen worse things than he could imagine and had somehow survived them. "Sit down," Katie said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The tone had shifted. The deferential mask slipped for just a second and what came through underneath was something authoritative. Something trained. Something that had given orders to people carrying weapons. "Sit down before you fall down, Marcus. You're about to collapse from your own hyperventilation. Sit. Now." He Saturday. The pistol dropped to his side. His legs folded underneath him and he hit the linoleum hard, the impact shaking his whole body, and Katie was already moving, already catching him before his head hit the floor, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her breathing still controlled, her voice still that same measured tone. "You're safe," she whispered. "Margaret's name matters. What happened to her matters. But you have to stay alive to make sure it matters. You understand? Stay alive. Stay conscious. The hyperventilation is going to pass. Just breathe with me. In for 5. Out for 5. In. Out. Hospital security came through the lower stairwell 46 seconds later. SWAT was 15 minutes out. But by then, the crisis had already resolved itself. A man sat on the floor of the waiting room with a nurse kneeling beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice steady, her presence so completely still and anchored that he couldn't help but orbit her gravity. She didn't look like a soldier. She looked like exactly what she'd been pretending to be. But something in how she'd moved, how she'd commanded without commanding, how her voice had dropped an octave when she gave that final order, that was a breadcrumb. That was a thread someone could have pulled if they were paying attention. If someone had been watching. What happened next would shake the entire foundation of Oak Creek Memorial. Dr. Hargrove's face had gone white the moment the gunman collapsed into that chair. He'd watched Katie Morrison, just a nurse, just some quiet woman in scrubs, command a 6'5" armed man the way a general commands a battalion. The way she'd moved. The precision. The absolute absence of fear. He made his first call from the golf course parking lot at 2:13 p.m., still in his visor and polo, hands shaking slightly as he dialed the hospital board chairman. "We have a serious liability issue." She engaged an armed subject without protocol, without authorization. She could have gotten people killed. The chairman listened. The chairman believed him. By 2:44 p.m., risk management had been notified. By 3:15 p.m., Hargrove had contacted Katie's references at the Navy Nurse Corps Training Command with a different story entirely, an ongoing investigation into falsified clinical documentation and conduct unbecoming. He didn't mention insurance fraud. He didn't mention that Katie had been asking questions about phantom surgeries and billing anomalies that didn't add up. Instead, he built a narrative about recklessness, insubordination, a nurse who violated protocol and put patients at risk. By 4:56 p.m., outside risk management consultants, people who'd never seen Katie work a shift, never watched her save a man's life with a voice and a chair, had issued their recommendation. Immediate termination. Recklessly engaging with an armed threat instead of following evacuation protocol. The words were typed into a formal report that smelled like money and predetermined conclusions. Security arrived at 4:51 p.m. Not rough, not cruel, just efficient. A tall man in a blue uniform with a radio clipped to his belt, and he carried a cardboard box. Katie's badge was deactivated before she even left the floor. She watched it happen in real time, the electronic chirp as her credentials were stripped, the badge handed back to her like a revoked passport. Her locker was emptied by someone from HR while other nurses watched from doorways, pretending not to watch. Everything she'd kept at Oak Creek Memorial went into that box, a spare pair of compression socks, the photo of her daughter's third-grade class, a protein bar she'd been saving for a shift that would never come. The escort was quiet. Professional. But she felt their eyes on her as she walked toward the exit, that cardboard box pressed against her chest like a shield, like evidence. One of the younger residents whispered something. Someone else turned away. The hospital doors slid open and the afternoon sun hit her face, and she was outside, standing in the parking lot of a place where she'd worked for 8 years, where she'd learned to disappear so completely that no one had ever asked a single question about who she really was. She drove home on autopilot. Muscle memory took over, right on Wade Avenue, left on Whitaker Mill Road, the same route she'd driven 1,000 times. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy. She'd chosen it specifically for the ordinariness of it. A place where no one asked questions. A place where a woman could hide in plain sight. Katie set the cardboard box on the kitchen table at 2:58 p.m. She sat in the chair beside it. She didn't move for 6 minutes. Just stared at the box, at the edge of a photo frame showing through the cardboard, at her old life compressed into a container meant for shipping. The rain started at 3:04 p.m., not a drizzle but a downpour, sheets of water hammering the kitchen window like an accusation. The apartment cooled instantly. Goosebumps rose on her forearms. She didn't get up to close the window. Sangin Valley in 2004 had sounded like this when they came under fire. Not the rain, the percussion of it. The way it filled the space where sound should be. Katie had been 26 years old then, a Navy corpsman attached to a SEAL detachment, moving through a compound outside the city while Taliban fighters used the elevated positions to pin down her team. She'd carried Mark Chen out through the southwest corridor, his left leg shattered at the femur, blood pooling in his boot. She'd carried him 7 meters under fire, her own round snapping past her ear, and she'd gotten him to the medic bird before his blood pressure dropped below 60. He'd survived. He'd walked again. But the cost of keeping that cost inside her for 20 years, the way she'd volunteered to leave the service rather than take a desk position, the way she'd changed her name on civilian documents just slightly, Morrison instead of her birth surname, the way she'd become invisible, was finally catching up to her. The tears came without warning. Just spilled out, hot and salt tasting, and she didn't wipe them away at first. She let them fall onto the kitchen table, watching them spread into small wet circles on the wood. 18 years of holding it together. 18 years of compartmentalizing Sangin into a locked room inside her mind where it couldn't touch anyone else. 18 years of being just a nurse because being Katie Morrison the warrior was too dangerous, too loud, too much of a liability to the quiet life she'd built for her daughter. At 3:17 p.m., her daughter's bus pulled up outside. Katie heard the familiar squeak of the hydraulic brakes, heard Emma's footsteps coming up the apartment stairs, heard the key slide into the lock. Then Emma was there, 9 years old with a backpack covered in stickers and math homework, and she was saying, "Mom, why are you home? You don't finish until like 6, and then she stopped because she saw her mother sitting at the kitchen table with red eyes and a cardboard box, and she saw the rain outside, and something in her face changed from confusion to fear. "Mommy? Why are you home early?" Emma's voice was smaller than usual. Scared. Katie wanted to lie. Katie was very good at lying. She'd lied to everyone at Oak Creek Memorial for 8 years, lied by omission, lied by silence, lied by being someone she was not. But Emma was standing in front of her with that look on her face, that look that said she was already piecing together that something was very wrong, and Katie couldn't do it. "I lost my job today, baby," Katie said. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. But her eyes were still wet, and that was enough to make Emma's lip tremble. "But you're the best nurse. Everyone says so." Why would they? Emma moved closer, and Katie pulled her daughter against her chest, breathing in the scent of her, strawberry shampoo and pencil lead and the particular smell of a child who'd spent the day at school. Emma's small arms wrapped around her mother's neck, and Katie held her like she was holding something fragile, something that could break if she wasn't careful. What Katie couldn't tell her daughter was that it wasn't about being a good nurse. It was about being a threat. It was about a man in a tailored suit who'd recognized something in her that day when she'd walked toward a gunman, something that said this woman had seen worse, much worse, and wasn't afraid. It was about the questions she'd asked, the charts she'd reviewed, the patterns she'd noticed in his billing codes. It was about Sangin, about the men she'd saved, about the cost of trying to live a normal life when your hands had held lives together under fire. The rain continued. Katie sat at the kitchen table with her daughter pressed against her, the cardboard box beside them full of the life she'd constructed. Somewhere in that box, pushed deep under the spare socks and the photo, were her old combat boots. Worn, cracked leather, the laces frayed from 12 years of use in desert terrain. She'd kept them hidden for so long, tucked into the back of the apartment closet, a relic of someone who no longer existed. A woman named something different. A senior chief petty officer. A person who'd led teams and made calls that meant the difference between life and death. Emma's breathing slowed against her mother's chest, becoming deeper, steadier. The rain drummed against the window. The apartment was dark except for the grey light filtering through the storm clouds. Katie closed her eyes and listened to her daughter breathe and let herself feel the weight of 18 years pressing down on her shoulders. And then, somewhere distant, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to Raleigh, didn't belong to this quiet afternoon. A rhythmic thumping, getting closer. The distinctive cadence of helicopter rotors cutting through the rain-heavy air. Coming from the east. Coming toward the city. Coming closer. Katie's eyes opened. Her hand stilled on her daughter's back. She knew that sound. She'd heard it 1,000 times. She knew what it meant. She knew who it was coming for. She had no idea what was about to happen next. For days. That's how long Katie Morrison sat in her kitchen watching the rain streak the windows before the FBI called. Not a question. Not a request. A command. They wanted her at Oak Creek Memorial for a routine interview at 2:13 p.m. Tuesday. She knew routine interviews didn't exist. She knew what was coming for her. She had no idea what was waiting in that conference room. The hospital hallways felt different now. The linoleum under her feet was the same, the antiseptic smell unchanged, but she was a ghost walking through it. Staff averted their eyes as she passed. Nobody spoke. She'd been erased in 4 days the way institutions erase people, as if she'd never existed. The badge they'd taken still hung in her locker at home, deactivated, useless as a toy. The FBI agent, young, clean-shaven, the kind of federal authority that made everyone straighten up, met her outside a conference room on the 3rd floor. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison," he said, and something in her chest tightened. He knew. They all knew. "That's not my name anymore," Katie said. "I know," he replied. "Come with me." The conference room was windowless, sterile, a place where truths got carved into permanent records. A file sat on the table. She reached for it and froze. Rashid Ahmed. Stab wound. Admitted overnight. Protected informant. Former Taliban fighter. The words blurred and realigned. She knew that name. 20 years dissolved in 3 seconds. The door opened. A man entered, olive skin, dark eyes, maybe 55, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to anticipate danger. His left arm was bandaged, the wound fresh, but he walked straight toward her and stopped. His hands trembled. Tears carved down his face like water through drought-parched earth. "You," he said in Pashto-accented English. "You held my boy's hand. In Sangin. The fighting stopped and you stayed with him. You were singing. Some American song. You sang to my son while the blood," his voice fractured. "He lived because of you." Katie couldn't move. The door opened again. This time a man in dress blues, captain's insignia, face she recognized but 20 years older, harder, eyes that had seen things. He stood at rigid attention and spoke the words that shattered every wall she'd built. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison. Captain James Mercer. Charlie Platoon. You pulled me out of the kill zone at Sangin in 2004. Carried me 847 meters under sustained fire." His jaw tightened. "You outranked everyone in that valley. You still do." The trembling started, not fear. Restraint. Another man stepped forward. Older. Gray threading through his beard. Seal trident on his chest. His voice like a transmission engine, low, purposeful, built for power. "I was your team leader. 12 years ago. Thought you were dead until 3 days ago." He looked at the file on the table. Bronze Star for Valor under fire at Forward Operating Base Shank. He paused. 1 beat. The room held its breath. Silver Star for medical intervention during Operation Enduring Freedom. Another pause. Longer this time. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. You pulled 7 wounded soldiers from a kill zone. Enemy fire from 3 positions. You had 38 seconds of cover. You used 42 seconds. His eyes locked on hers. "That's the bravest thing I've ever witnessed." Katie's hands pressed flat against the table. The world existed in a single moment, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the smell of old coffee and paper, the weight of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in 18 years. The FBI agent cleared his throat. "Ms. Morrison, or rather, Senior Chief, our investigation into Dr. Hargrove's insurance fraud expanded when we discovered he was attempting to forge your personnel records. Deleted your incident reports. The ones documenting billing irregularities. He knew you were a threat. We estimate he was trying to build grounds for immediate termination when the shooting occurred. The agent's voice carried no emotion. He made a tactical error. Panic makes criminals sloppy. His attempt to alter federal employment documents connected him to 18 months of documented fraud. Approximately $847,000 in falsified claims. The door burst open. Dr. Hargrove stood in the hallway, mouth opening to speak, chest puffed with the confidence of a man who'd never been held accountable. He saw Katie. He saw the military officers. His face drained the way sand drains from an hourglass, all at once, all the way. The FBI agent stood. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, you're under arrest for federal fraud, falsification of employment records, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists like a period at the end of a sentence. He tried to pull away. I don't, this is insane, I have connections. His voice climbed toward hysteria. Sweat beaded on his forehead. This wasn't happening to men like him. Men with credentials. Men with board seats. Men with allies. But it was. They walked him past the nursing station on the 3rd floor. 23 nurses stopped what they were doing. Nobody looked away this time. Nobody pretended Katie had never existed. They watched as Dr. Hargrove was led down the hallway, stumbling, still trying to negotiate. I was trying to protect the hospital, he was saying. She was a liability. You don't understand what she is. What she was. What she'd always been. 6 months later, Katie Morrison stood in the Director of Patient Safety office on the 5th floor of Oak Creek Memorial. New title. New authority. Same hands that had held dying soldiers now held the power to change how a hospital protected its vulnerable. The office was hers. The desk was hers. The window with a view of Raleigh's skyline was hers. And on the shelf behind her desk, visible to anyone who entered, sat a pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan. Scuffed. The laces still knotted in the hitch Katie had learned 23 years ago. They weren't hidden anymore. They weren't secrets. They were proof. Dr. Hargrove was teaching CPR classes at Piedmont Community College now, making $16.47 an hour, his name on a badge that read instructor instead of doctor. His medical license had been revoked. His pension had been clawed back. The hospital had severed every connection to him with the precision of removing a tumor. When patients asked where he'd gone, they were told a simple truth: he no longer worked there. Katie was reviewing patient safety protocols at her desk when Captain Mercer appeared in her doorway in civilian clothes. Dark jeans. A blazer. The kind of outfit that couldn't hide what he was. Behind him stood Rashid Ahmed, his wound healing, his arms stronger every day. The man whose son Katie had held 20 years ago in the chaos of a firefight. I came to thank you, Rashid said. My boy, he's studying engineering now. He's alive because you refused to let him die. Katie stood. She didn't extend her hand for a handshake. She pulled both men into an embrace, and in that gesture was every moment of restraint, every silent lunch, every insult she'd absorbed without breaking. The boots on the shelf behind her caught the afternoon light. How many? Captain Mercer asked, looking around the office. How many what? Katie said. How many lives have you saved since you took this job? In 6 months. Katie turned back to her desk. The file was open. The numbers were exact. 14 patient safety protocols implemented. 38 incidents of potential fraud identified. 216 lives impacted by the changes we made. She looked up. That's just the beginning. The silence in that office was the kind that comes after someone speaks truth so profound there's nothing left to add. Mercer saluted, not military protocol, but genuine respect. Rashid bowed. And Katie, Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison, sat back down at her desk and returned to the work she'd always been meant to do. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. And restraint, she now understood, was the most powerful weapon she'd ever carried. The next time someone told her that heroes wore specific uniforms or held specific titles, she wouldn't argue. She'd just keep her boots visible on that shelf, a reminder that strength looks like patience until the moment it doesn't. That quiet people aren't weak, they're gathering evidence. That the person you underestimate might be the only thing standing between you and catastrophe. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were, subscribe. If you've ever wanted to see someone like Dr. Hargrove face consequences for their actions, hit like. And comment, would you have walked toward danger, or would you have run? What would you have done if you were Katie Morrison?